Okay, so my name's Kirsten. I'm based at Birmingham City University in Birmingham, so hello from Brum. And what I'll do before I get into the intros and the thank yous, I will start from reading a passage from the book. So yeah, to give us a sense, give you all a sense of like kind of where this is coming from. So our work began with a question about how popular understandings of global conflicts come about. The discussion of Europe's responsibilities to people in movement has resurrected questions about the interdependency of the international community, our responsibilities to each other, and the terms of international law. We argue that limited knowledge about the histories and challenges facing different regions of the world, particularly involving the legacy of Western intervention in these countries, leads to an inability to comprehend contemporary global conflicts and also those who have fled those conflicts. In so doing, we consider the habits of media use that inform audiences in Italy and the UK, as well as the frameworks of representation utilized by mainstream media to depict global conflict and European interests. We begin from the perspective that the range and manner of contemporary media use is a significant factor in analyses of attitudes to migration, not only in relation to the representation of migrants and migration, but also in relation to the larger framing of global interconnectedness and mutual responsibility. In particular, media representations play a central role in popular understandings of global conflicts and other international events. In times of changing global relations and large-scale population movements, what is understood and believed about global events becomes uncertain, and we argue this uncertainty shapes attitudes to political institutions and to migration. So that's will give you hopefully a little taste of yeah, so what this book is about. So I'll now start with some intros and some thank yous. So I've introduced myself. I also wanted to introduce Janna Graham, who's based at Goldsmiths, University of London, and Federico Oliveri, who's joining us from Pisa in Italy. He's based at University of Pisa, and as well as want to introduce Victoria Mponda, who's a founding member of Global Sistaz United, which is a group of refugee women based in Nottingham, who's played a very important role in our project. So that's everyone who's on the call today. And I also wanted to now move to some thank yous. First of all, I wanted to thank Gargi Bhattacharya, who was also central to this book in terms of both the research that we carried out and also the writing of this book, but unfortunately can't join us today due to other commitments. We've also wanted to thank the Arts and Humanities Research Council for funding the research that produced this book. I also wanted to thank the my own institution, Birmingham City University, and the Faculty Research Investment Scheme for providing me with some time to pull this book together. I also wanted to thank the organizations we collaborated with, particularly Birmingham Asylum and Refugee Association, which is a self-organized group of refugees in Birmingham, Global Sistaz United, which I've already mentioned. I'd like to thank Implicated Theatre, who we collaborated with when we did some theater performances, which we'll talk to you about in a bit. We'll also show you pictures of the theater productions. We've also wanted to thank Cantieri Mitici, who is a theater company based in Bologna, Italy, who also helped with the theater production we did in Italy. We wanted to thank Manchester University Press for their support in publishing this book and also for organizing today's event. And finally, wanted to thank everyone for coming. So in terms of the structure of today's events, what we'll do is we've set ourselves a series of questions which we're going to answer about the book, and then we'll also be showing you some images from the project, and then we'll hand it over to you so you can ask us some questions. And yeah, I mean, if there are lots of questions, we could run over a little bit. If there are lots and lots of questions, we can answer them over email. So the first question we wanted to sort of ask ourselves here, and we'll talk about is how did this book come about? So I just wanted to say that when we first started this project, one thing I wanted to point out was that this was at a time when the images of Alan Kurdi were circulating in the media. And I'm actually now just going to show you an image so you can see the kinds of headlines that are in the news. So yeah, so you can see some of the news headlines that were, you know, you can see in the newspapers where it felt like, at least, you know, very temporarily, there was a shift in attitudes. Instead of, you know, the continual headlines, you know, describing refugees as parasites and scroungers, you start talking about sort of humanitarian catastrophes. And then we also started to see groups talking about, you know, trying to arrange donations to Calais and other places. We started to see the refugees welcome hashtag being used on Twitter and so on. And so it felt like there was a quite a large shift that happened. But then this was also a very brief temporary moment. as soon as this moment took place, it started replaced by images of the attacks in Cologne and Paris, and the kind of xenophobic anti-refugee rhetoric started to return. I guess, and so in some ways, what we're really trying to ask, and I think we kind of it was also in the passage I read out, is the reason for the kind of briefness and the kind of thinness actually of the solidarity was because ultimately there's a real limited understanding about conflicts in other parts of the world, and the circumstances where people flee these conflicts. And this is to do with how they're mediated. And so we wanted to really connect the dots in terms of thinking about how do we understand global conflicts? How are these limited by, I think, Eurocentric understandings and the way they're represented in the media? And how does that then shape our attitudes towards people who flee these conflicts? So yeah, and then briefly, I think what I also wanted to do is I just wanted to give you a sense of the field work that we carried out. So what did we do? So we did some media analysis of some Italian and British newspapers covering the conflicts in countries that sent many refugees. We did a survey of young people in the UK and Italy about how they basically how they use the media and how their use of media helped them understand global conflicts, how they understood the role of political institutions and international responsibility. We did some online ethnography about the kind of solidarity initiatives that we mentioned, and also some anti-refugee groups we saw on social media. We did quite a few interviews with asylum seekers and refugees in the UK and Italy, and then with these materials we started to do these workshops and sort of a visualization exercise, and we also developed some performances. And yeah, and as you can see, there's a link, conflictmemorydisplacement.com, where you can see a lot of this material. And I think I'm now going to hand you over to Victoria, and she's going to say a little bit about about the project, and Janna as well.
Oh yeah, hi. So we joined up. I got an email from one of our contacts that introduced us to Janna, and it was we were looking at projects to do for Refugee Week, because we always used to do a lot of activities to recognize Refugee Week, and we wanted something different that wasn't, so, working with the same audience coming in to support us. People, year after year, we've got the same people that we were talking to. So talking to Janna and Kirsten, it looked like a very good project where we were going to be collaborating with them and maintaining ownership of what we are putting together, because a lot of times we get researchers coming to us to say, "Oh, we're working on this. Can I come and do interviews and talk to you and tell us what your thoughts are or what your experience is?" So yeah, that's why we connected with Janna and Kirsten.
Okay, thanks. And I think Janna's going to say about.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that the research for us was, equally about understanding the media and the representations, and also how information circulates around this particular moment, but more in general terms as well. But it was also we wanted to counter some of those narratives and test ways in which we might counter them. And so we'll talk later about some of the methods that we use to try and think alongside Victoria and our partners at BARA and Implicated Theatre about what role can we play in producing either counter media or other kind of strategies that change or somehow repattern the narratives and relationships that are set up through those narratives. And so it was really crucial for us, as Victoria is saying, that we were in collaboration with groups who were self-organized and autonomous, so weren't necessarily part of the charity apparatus. Because of the nature of the importance of the voices of refugees, which are very often absent or repeated in the same kind of patterns time after time, called upon to repeat the same story in the same format again and again. And so we felt that was really important, and that we needed to work really, as Victoria is saying, really in direct collaboration in terms of both the narratives, but also the ownership of the final kind of results of that aspect of the research.
Okay, thanks, Janna. So the second question we've set ourselves is to do with how does the media coverage of global conflicts affect how we see refugees, and what does this have to do with legacies of colonialism? So I'm going to be able to talk a little bit about the analysis we did of the newspapers, and then Federico is going to say a little bit about how about the Italian media. So so the analysis we did of British newspapers, it was the Daily Mail and the Guardian. We noticed that conflicts in other parts of the world, kind of outside of Europe, tend to be covered from the point of view of European interests. So it was a question of is there some kind of conflict there that could lead to global instability, or do they have a lot of resources, like such as oil, for example, that are of interest to European nations, or do the conflicts threaten to send lots of people to kind of claim asylum in European countries? So there was that kind of lens on conflicts in other parts of the world. And one of the things we noticed is that the coverage tended to focus on events happening in the field, in the kind of theater of war. And the wider context wasn't really discussed in terms of why are these conflicts taking place in the first place, and who are the real actors here. And also we noticed that when local populations were interviewed, it was only really as eyewitnesses about these events happening in the field, and people were rarely asked for their opinion or their analysis about what was going on and how it could be changed. And there was no discussion of histories of foreign intervention or legacies of imperialism or exploitation or violence. And for example, it's notable that countries which often from which many people flee, such as Iraq or Afghanistan or Eritrea or Somalia, have long histories of colonialism and Western intervention. And so therefore, if we don't have that kind of context, if that's not really provided to us as media audiences, then it's so much easier to frame refugees as just arriving unannounced on European shores, and then ultimately, I think, as we saw from some of the tabloids, as sort of abusers of generosity, because there's no conflicts and no context for understanding the conflicts people have fled, and not really much of a sense of global responsibility. So that's how things ended up playing out. So maybe Federico, if you could say a little bit about the Italian media.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, let me see how the media analysis was done in Italy. I selected just a few mainstream newspapers, Corriere della Sera, Repubblica, and in order to show that also this mainstream media, rather progressive also, share the same perspective, the same narrative as the more, let's say, right-wing oriented popular press like Il Giornale or Libero. Of course, the language was different. Libero and Il Giornale, these two popular right-wing newspapers, usually use a very pressurizing language against migrants in general and against refugees in particular. But the frame concerning war was the same. In which sense? In the sense that it was very ethnocentric, and the paradigm in this case was the Iraqi war. The only preoccupation was for our troops there, or for the Christian minorities attacked by the Islamic State. So no care for local people, no care for civil victims of war, no critical analysis about our role in this invasion of Iraq. The other example was Eritrea. You know that Eritrea was the first Italian colony in Africa. But the first time these newspapers talk about Eritrea after years was after the dramatic shipwreck which occurred on the 3rd October 2013 in Lampedusa, because the victims, more than 280, were all, or most of them, were Eritreans. So after more than 10 years of silence, of complete silence of Eritrea, the first opportunity to talk about the country was on this terrible event, in order to start to understand why people are fleeing Eritrea. But let me say that what shocked me more after this analysis was that even if news are manipulated or lacking, there is always a kind of emotional distance towards migrants. So even if people know very well what is going on actually in Libya, for instance, another Italian colony, and even if all in Italy know that we are paying the so-called Libyan government and the so-called Coast Guard, the Libyan Coast Guard, to keep people and keep boats there and bring people in prisons, where we know very well that people are in slavery condition, or women are the object, the victim of sexual violence, that people are kidnapped and tortured. We know this very well, but there is a terrible emotional distance. So we are no more connected with these people. They are just, piece of meat, let's say so. Otherwise, I cannot understand why these news which come around do not provoke any political reaction. The parliament just 1 month ago renewed the so-called agreement with Libya in order to block people there. So this is the point. Why are even the information comes around not provoking reaction?
Okay, thanks, Federico. So what we're going to do now is so the next question we're sort of asking ourselves is, how did the state, the media, and society construct people as migrants? So I think what I'd like to do first of all is talk a little bit about the approach we took to doing interviews. Like, I think as Janna has, and I think Victoria suggested, I think what when we interviewed refugees, we didn't want to do what Lesbach and Shamsur Sinha has called extractive research, where it's like, tell me the story of your migration journey, and that's basically it. Because we felt like then if we were doing that, we'd be reproducing, I think, what the media and I think and even the Home Office, I think, are trying to do. So what we did was we took a different approach. We were drawing on the work of Frigga Haag, who is a feminist sociologist, who and what she was doing was, so she developed this method of critical memory work, which was kind of inspired by kind of consciousness raising groups in sort of 1970s feminism. And what happens is a group of women would get together to talk about their memories and their experiences of being a girl, of being a woman. And the point of these discussions would be for them to understand how they had been constructed as women. And so, and in doing so, they realized that the memories they had of their girlhood, of their weren't just their own personal memories, but a lot of their experiences were shared. And that way they could see how they'd been constructed as women. So we were trying to work with this method to look at how people had been constructed as migrants. But I think maybe there are a couple of big differences between what we were doing, what Frigga Haag was doing. I mean, with the groups that Frigga Haag was working with, people would meet for a really long period of time. They would, get to know each other very well, meet over a year and so on. We weren't really working with that kind of time frame, I think, due to the limitations of this project. But also, I think what was different from the consciousness raising groups is not like, it's not like the people working with needed their consciousness to be raised because they knew how they were being constructed as migrants, but it's more that we felt that the ones who really needed to be their consciousness to be raised was really the wider British and Italian society. And so often when we started the interviews, we'd ask people about, what are moments when you felt you were treated as a migrant? And a lot of the stories that came out were, a lot of them were about just the all the the issues with the asylum system, which is the harshest and cruelest part of the hostile environment. So people living on, like, you know, around £5 a day to live on, for example. In the UK, people are living in housing that's managed by, you know, these outsourced companies like Serco and G4S in really terrible conditions. People have to sign in on a regular basis at these reporting centers, and you know, and it's well known that sometimes if you go into these reporting centers, you sometimes can be deported from them, so you don't come out. But also, people talked about the kinds of media representations of immigrants as scroungers and so on. They also talked about and they also talked about the kinds of dealings they had with members of society. Like for example, I'm just going to read a couple of the interviews. Like I think one person we interviewed in Birmingham said that when they said that they're asylum seeker, they said, like, when they hear those words, they get serious. If they smile, they stop smiling. So those kinds of experiences as well. So basically that's how the kind of hostile environment played out, I think, and sort of from the state, from the media, and from society. So instead of the kind of stories of the migration story, what we got is an awful lot of experiences of discrimination. And what was sort of interesting is that some of these stories were actually about experiences of racism, and the way that racism and xenophobia crossed over was quite interesting, because some ways they were separate. In some ways, there is also a sense that for those from kind of ethnic minority backgrounds, that there's a sense of being seen as a you know, continual foreigner, and that's something I think after our project we've kind of learned from the Windrush scandal. But yeah, so these are the stories that came out. Does anyone have anything else they wanted to add in terms of that?
Yeah, so my experience personally was, well, if I wasn't supported by the community that I was living in, because I had to go in. My mother was deported in 2013, and then I became homeless. So the refugee forum, the people that I worked with as a volunteer, one of the families hosted me for close to 10 years. I was living with them until I got my papers. And this is where, so the situation is, they are telling you you're not allowed to access support from anywhere, and you're single or you don't have any families anywhere. And it's like, how do you tell these people these stories? And they're asking you to pay for all of these solicitors, if you want to live, eat, clothe yourself, all of that. Where do you find the resources? So this is where the community comes in. We were looking at ours, accessing food banks, clothes banks, and yeah, so I didn't really have financial support from anywhere except for the family that looked after me for in the years that I was waiting for my resident, you know, for my visa to come through. But it's Janna mentioned, Kirsten mentioned the reporting center. I was fortunate that they never asked me to do that, and it's one of the things that they give you when you do your interview for asylum. You're presented with a letter that says you have to report. It can be monthly, fortnightly, or every 6 months, or whatever they choose to tell you to do. And then it's when you're going there with that card that says you're eligible to be deported at any time. So whether you have a case or not in the Home Office, it doesn't matter. When they choose to detain you, they'll just take you away. So the dangers there with the reporting is not a lot of people have support outside. Those who are connected with communities that the Nottingham Refugee Forum do tend to let people know that I'm going to report, so that they know when they're going in there, they phone somebody to say I'm going in, so when they come out, they'll let them know as well that I'm out. There used to be some, through Arimathea here in Nottingham as well, they used to have a bus where they would collect people to take them to the reporting center and bring them back. But unfortunately, when they started cutting the funding everything went. So, and they don't usually put you in a situation where you're going to report with your friends. They just give you dates. So a lot of the times you make friends my friends will tell me we make friends on the bus going to the reporting center, but a lot of the times you are alone. You're by yourself, you go in there, and children as well. They have to take their children to the reporting centers. So it's really a horrendous person. You know, it's the reporting center is literally it feels to me, I've never been there, but the way it's been reported to me, it's been told to me, it feels like a prison, because you are in there waiting to be told whether you're going to go or, you know, they're going to take you away. And you are literally, they're going to deport you, they do put you in handcuffs like a criminal. So it's not, so imagine every time that anxiety of waiting to get on the bus an hour. So it takes like most of the, so it's, I think it's about an hour to get there and an hour to come back. I'm not quite sure because I've never been there. But you're on the bus, going there, not knowing what will happen, and then you're in there for however long you need to be in there. And you can't phone anyone. You can't take any phones that has pictures. It's just, you know, if you do have a phone, they take it away from you. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say on the reporting thing.
I think there's something, I mean, that reporting center represents just really being in that again, it's of being in the sharp end of the immigration system, but also being exposed to that kind of arbitrary, arbitrary power, isn't it really? And so this is where I think, you know, again, the kind of community solidarity, I think, becomes really important. And that sort of leads us to our next question, which is about how do we challenge representations of refugees as helpless victims? And I'm going to hand you over to Janna and Victoria so they can answer that question.
Do you want to go first?
Do you want me to?
Yes.
Okay, so I think we were going to look at the slide. Which, do we have that up, the first slide? We can't see it for some reason. Yeah, perfect. Okay, great. So so one of the ways that we started to, you know, we worked from this this kind of memory framework, conflict memory kind of work framework, where we would use some of the transcripts of the interviews and the material that was generated to then sort of start to derive kind of core themes that people were experiencing and repeated themes. And we started to work also with themes, but also with kind of concrete images. And in a minute, I'll tell you how we did that. But in the first instance, we wanted to really produce a counter to the mediatic narrative. So we decided that we would create an alternative newspaper in Nottingham that would be drawn from the experiences of refugees in Nottingham. And the decision was made by Victoria and other members of Global Sisters to call it the double standard. And Victoria, you had some thoughts about why that was. I'll let you tell that story.
We were looking at how the immigration system is set up to really favor the politicians, the same people who come out during elections to say, oh, we've got too many people coming into the country, why are they coming here? They're the same people who are letting in the rich people, because, you know, I was laughing the other day, I saw, what's her name, Priti Patel, saying that they're going to introduce something in the immigration system to stop criminals from coming into the country, or stopping them from, which is laughable to me, because a lot of people that they allow to come to their countries, universities, wherever, they're the criminals. Looking at the like universities. Sorry?
You mean like heads of state and their children?
Heads of state and their children. Yeah, I was saying to Janna the other day, because I applied when I was I grew up in Zimbabwe. When I was applying to come here, I applied to get to come in to Nottingham University, and I couldn't get in. But for ministers, you know, like the Mugabe regime, or their children. They're able to come in, and then you hear, oh, they've got sanctions against, this country because of Mugabe and his people, these dictators, what they're doing to their people. But when the same people you're saying you're trying to protect come to you and say, we need your support, we are being killed, we need your help, they're the first people to say, no, we don't want you here. And then I think there was a slide there to show you about sports. We talked about how people are perceived. So, for example, we talked a lot about sports, like Mo Farah. When he wins, he's a British national. He's celebrated as a British sports person and blah, blah, blah. But when he does something wrong, the first sentence will be Somalian-born, athlete has done this. So they take away their ownership on the person when they see that he is seen as, in a negative light. But when he's done something great, they don't even put in that he was born in Somalia. He's just British. So those kind of that's where the double standards came in, as the name for the magazine, for the newspaper.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. I think Janna was going to speak to this as well.
Yeah, just that the different sections, obviously, it was a spoof newspaper, so it was kind of mimicking the main sections of mainstream newspapers. And so the lifestyle section was particularly brutal, because it was really looking at, and women in Global Sisters sort of sat and brainstormed, what are the various ways in which lifestyle articulates itself as a refugee. And one of the images that they really kept returning to was this kind of idea of life in handcuffs, that even if people weren't incarcerated in a detention center, that there were all of these blockages to every aspect of life within kind of society. And so it was really important in this part of the process to counter, I guess, what we hear often in the press, but also in a lot of charity work around refugees, which is the sort of A, the kind of sad story, and B, the sort of good migrant story. And these are the kind of narratives that are kind of requested and called upon from the asylum system, from the press, often from researchers, and sometimes from the people who are meant to be supporting refugee causes. So this sort of came up again and again, was how does this narrative form also function as a way of sort of blocking certain kinds of experiences? So that doing the spoof newspaper was really important in terms of just like allowing a space to talk about how absolutely racist and shitty things are in the UK. That this story that begins, the colonial story, the migrant story, which begins with, I had a terrible life. I faced hardship when I crossed over, and when I arrived, I was treated so nicely by these people in England to whom I'm grateful. That this had to be destabilized, and that was the first kind of step. And we thought that we would move and we would work with humor, but actually it was very difficult to work with humor before we could just actually name these processes of blocking that Victoria is talking about, and the absolute violence of them. And then I guess from the newspaper, we moved into in the newspaper, we came up with a series of images like life in handcuffs, and we then started to work with a group in London, which is a migrant and non-migrant led theatre company called Implicated Theatre, who were working with groups in London on a similar process to ours, but then also came and workshopped a series of images with members of BARA in Birmingham and with Global Sisters in Nottingham. And we started to then workshop these different kinds of, we called them images. We used two different kind of theater techniques, I suppose. One is called Ethno-Drama, and Ethno-Drama is where essentially it's, you go through transcripts that come out of interviews or other kinds of research processes and turn them into scripts. So we started to do that, but we didn't work so much with scripts because we sort of paired Ethno-Drama with Theatre of the Oppressed, where we worked with a series of kind of visual images that we could present to different kinds of publics and allow different participatory relationships with those experiences. So yeah, what Kirsten's showing was first the images from the media analysis that had been undertaken, and then second, some of the theater pieces themselves. And so I think there's an image before that, isn't there, Kirsten, or is that not here? No, oh, that's strange. Okay, so one of the things that we found in the theater process, you know, in one case, the kind of lifestyle section that had been this kind of idea of life in handcuffs got enacted as a circle with all different members of Global Sisters sort of holding up signs that said sort of NHS, society. There's a woman in the middle who's trying to, yeah, this is the piece, who's trying to sort of go around to each of these kind of aspects of society and tell a story that allows her entry. And this was like a consistent kind of theme that ran through a lot of the workshops that we did, which was the way that the narrative around being a refugee had to be told in a certain way in order to unlock certain kinds of access. And this story of the good migrant, which really limited kind of life experiences, or the telling of life experiences, was sort of entrapping people in these different kinds of blocked kind of spaces. And that was, you know, filtering obviously down from the media into the micropolitics of everyday life. And so I think this is a really important aspect of the project, is that, you know, that the mediatic narratives are, you know, very much embedded now in the micropolitical lives that people are experiencing on the ground. So the next image, which is where I'll maybe stop talking, is, oh no, not that one, the one, 2 images before. Sorry, Kirsten. Yes, the one that's at the bus stop. Not this one, yeah, the bus stop one.
Yeah.
Because you're going to talk about this one, right, Victoria? Yeah. So this one at the bus stop, this was a kind of reenactment of someone's experience where they had been at a bus stop and they felt that, you know, there was a woman who was there who was born in Britain and had lived, felt that she was British. And the other woman was a more recent migrant, and she was asking for directions. And the woman who is, you know, sort of considered herself to be from the UK, kept asking questions and basically probing for her to tell the story of the good migrant. And if she didn't, she wouldn't get the directions. So she said, well, I have to go to report to the detention center. It's, you know, really annoying. It's super violent. The woman would kind of shut down. If she said, oh, you know, I'm so grateful to be here, then the woman would give her the directions. And people talk to us about a lot of these kind of everyday life experiences of the gatekeeping around the story. And so, yeah, so Victoria, you were going to talk about another example, which I think you've touched on already.
Okay, I think that would be the reporting center. So that just, yeah, so people were, I think this is where people were using their own experiences and how they found the reporting center. For example, we had this woman who had just moved to Nottingham, and she was happy to say, oh, I want to go and report. When they see me, they're happy, they love my kids, and blah, blah, blah. And I think it only took her about 6 months. And then that kind of drained the life out of her. And it was every time she would have to be taught. You know, there's also self-harming within the community. And I was surprised to learn that she was, you know, we had that within our community, because it's something that I've always seen on TV. And not in the Black community, but more in, you know, with white European or American or wherever. So when she was telling me that, you know, this is what it's making her do every time she has to think of going there, with everything else that's happening in her life, to control that anxiety is what she has to do. So that kind of, you know, yeah. So it was just painful to listen to. It's all painful to listen to and imagine, because we have to have phone numbers for everybody who has to go and report, so that within the group itself, not, you know, like a refugee forum or any other organization that supports you, but within ourselves, we need to talk to each other to say, oh, by the way, they sent me a letter, I'm going to report on such a day. I'll let you know when I come out. So those are so not only are they the only, you know, the ones who are being anxious, but we are also anxious because we've gone through where people have been detained and you don't know where they are. You can't contact them. It can take a week, however long, for them to actually find a phone that they can call you, because they don't have the numbers. All their numbers are in their phone that they have to leave with at the security desk. And then they're not given those phones because they've got cameras in there. So for them to ask, they can't, unless they have solicitors who can contact us then to say, this is what's happened. And then it's like, what do we do? How do we support this person when you don't have resources yourself? And it usually happens on a Friday.
Yeah, well, that's just perfect for spoiling everybody's weekend. Then, okay, so I think what we'll do, I'll hand over to Federico, and he's going to talk a little bit about the theater production in Italy, and I'll show some images from there as well.
Yeah, we try to translate the results of our media analysis and our interviews in a script, according to the methodology of the Ethno-Drama. First of all, the Krista Haug methodology was very appreciated by the people, because it provided really the occasion to have a critical standpoint on common sense on immigration and immigration control. So this going through the process of migrantification was very appreciated as a kind of critique of a exercise of power, because finally migration control is about power. So I can still remember one of the first things Abraham said to me. He was coming from Eritrea, and it was a general, diciamo, reflection on the link between colonialism and migration. And he said very simply, if you want migration to stop, just stop exploiting us in Africa. So this is the main point many of them brought about in this collective discussion. Why we in our Western countries avoid any discussion about our role in creating the conditions for migration. We only see people when they are coming to our borders or cross the borders or come and ask for their rights, but we never see the process before, which is the main point, this new form of colonialism which create the condition for migration. So this was very interesting. And another point another guy told us about was about this continuous incitement to be grateful. We were in the big migrant crisis in Italy, so we had more than 200,000 people in reception facilities, which is a huge number for us. And every time, every day in the media was a discussion about how much they cost us and how much they should be grateful for what they receive. And there were also some protests because food and services were very poor. So, of course, they are not grateful enough. So this was also a point of criticism because they felt they were reduced to bare life. Just the fact to receive food and shelter was enough. And every other request for rights, for dignity, for autonomy, for humanity was too much. And this was very, very, very strong and came also in this representation. But let's come us to the spectacle and this point in particular. Abraham came from Eritrea. So in these 5 images we selected, you can see these pieces of the spectacle. The first image is he reading his own history in a very peculiar way, because we try to reject another injunction to tell sad stories. So he told us rather ironical stories, adventure stories, like a young guy who just tried to escape from a prison and find his place in the world. So it was rather a Bildungsroman, very exciting, but also very ironical, but also very tough. You know, in Eritrea, people, both guys and girls, are forced to attend a never-ending military service, during which they have to perform forced labor, finally. So he escaped one day with two other guys, and tried to go to Sudan, to Libya, and then to Europe. And then, yeah, what happened? Another image. In Lampedusa, this enormous shipwreck was the first time our country, Italy, tried to face what was going on Eritrea. But the third image was another piece of this story, because he denounced a very continuity between the violence people experience in Eritrea and the violence Eritrean refugees experience in Italy. This is a scene taken from a forced eviction in the center of Rome, from a building squatted by Eritrean refugees. And this apparently very nice gesture of the policeman was denounced by Abraham as a very colonial gesture. Violence and paternalism. We will help you, but you don't have rights. So, and the final one, because he decided to become an activist. Now he is one of the leaders of the Eritrean movement in the diaspora in Italy, and he is trying to make people aware about what is going on in the country. So denouncing torture, denouncing military service, denouncing the dictatorship. And so this is his way to take the floor, take the public space, and subvert the narrative of the victim.
Okay, thanks, Federico. So it's now getting, let's see, it's now getting close to 3 o'clock. I think what we'll do is we'll have to run over, I think, a little bit. But I was wondering if we could just very, very briefly answer question 5. It's about how we work collaboratively with refugee organizations. I think we've talked about that a little bit already, so maybe we could just answer very briefly to that one, and then we'll go to our final question. I think Janna,
Yes.
Victoria, you're going to answer that one.
Yes. Okay. So for us, our group, the way we created the group was to empower ourselves to actually do the work ourselves. So although we didn't have resources, my role as one of the founders was to find, connect with groups like Janna and Kirsten, so that we can use their resources to tell our story in our own way and retain it, so that people don't just take it and go away. And also we have learned through collaborating with people like different, we've worked with different groups, we've done exhibitions, and we were trying to find a way to tell our story so it's not sad. Because within ourselves, we laugh at this, this system. For example, my friend, when she did her interview, first interview for an asylum claim, they were asking her, why didn't you go to the police and report, all of these things that was happening, against you? Because in Nigeria, they said, yes, why didn't you go to the police? She said, I don't have money. What do you mean you don't have money? For the police to do anything for you, you have to have money to pay them to do their job. So I didn't have money to tell them to come and, to go and report that I've been raped, somebody killed my family. So I didn't bother to go because I didn't have money. So within ourselves, we laugh, but we wanted to find a way to actually make it in I think the group, the theater group, introduced us to a way, to learn to build the stories in like a comedian, to tell the stories that way, so that it's not always sad, crying, and maybe that way we can reach a wider audience, and maybe they'll be more welcoming to listen to what we have to say.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. I think, Janna, can you just speak very briefly? I think there's a point you wanted to make about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's just two different things in the theater, like different sides to it, I guess. One side was that we worked within refugee groups. So as Victoria was saying, sort of use the theater to share strategies, essentially. So reenact and sort of participate in scenes like the reporting center to share the stories that actually work, you know, and the kind of ways of approaching the authorities that work. So there's a part of the theater that was about, you know, sort of migrant groups talking to each other about what they needed to do and what they needed to know. And then there was another side that was much more focused on kind of white culture, which was you know, asking people in communities who are not from a migrant background to kind of occupy these situations and try and understand and sort of put themselves in scenarios so that they could start to conceptualize the racism and xenophobia of the migration system. So there were these two sides of the collaboration. And then just to say very practically, in terms of the project itself, it was really important, you know, that we thought about redistributing resources, and we really worked in the theater more as facilitators, those of us who are more from a research background. So we, you know, did sort of organized childcare, we organized food, we organized payment, you know, those kinds of things that I think people don't often talk about, but are really crucial in terms of like making sure that we can have an open conversation about the resources and how they're being distributed in a project. So those are just some little bits on the nature of the collaboration. I think it's really important to say that there's two sides to this. One is sort of self-determination and framing the narrative like you've described, Victoria, and the other side of it is addressing white culture, because this is, you know, where the work is needing to be done. And so yeah, anyway.
Okay, thanks, Janna. I think what we'll do now is there's just one final question, and again, because we're short for time, I think we might, if we could just maybe just briefly talk about it before we open to the floor, and I think we're going to run over a little bit, I think. And what we'll do is, and there were some questions that have been coming through. We'll try to answer some of them, and the rest we can email you our responses. So our final question is just thinking about the book in the context of the present, particularly the Black Lives Matter protests and the larger questions this is revealed around structural racism and also around legacies of colonialism. I mean, I'll start in that, you know, I'd say that, I mean, that I think it is a really important moment in terms of these questions are being asked that weren't being asked in the past, or if they're being asked, they kind of weren't really being heard. But I think that the kinds of questions that have come up around Black Lives Matter, I think it's important that we also apply these to the hostile environment and to the, you know, and particularly how refugees are treated. And I just wanted to reiterate that refugees are still living on £5.39p a day, and you know, in the middle of a pandemic. And you know, people are still living in housing that's managed by G4S and Serco under quite squalid conditions, which is, you know, and of course, what does that mean? Again, we're living under a pandemic. And now what's just happened is that after the ban on evictions has now ended, so now large numbers of people are being evicted from home office accommodations. So a lot of this stuff has been going on. But also, I think the kinds of links need to be made between the critiques of colonialism that have come out around, for example, the statues and you know, the kinds of symbols of colonial legacies. But I think it's also, again, important that we look at how these legacies of colonialism play out in the immigration system, and around who has mobility and who does not have mobility. And as I said before, I mean, the Rendress scandal kind of happened after our project, but I think it then sort of illustrates, I think, what those links are. I wonder if maybe the others could maybe just briefly respond to that before we turn to the questions.
Yeah, if I can. Just one concept. Despite the fact that the former Ministry of Interiors, Salvini, is not in place anymore, policies concerning immigration control did not change in Italy. So the decrees named by him, the Salvini decrees, are still in force. And these two decrees are very awful because they criminalize NGOs making search and rescue in the Mediterranean, and prevent people who ask for asylum to register in the municipalities which is the way to have access to rights, social rights, to services. So finally, maybe the rhetoric is over, the crisis is over, but it left deep roots in the people, and we still have a lot of difficulties to be to mobilize people on an anti-racist platform. And it could be even worse, because now we have in the government the central left. So before we had these same people in the streets with us against the central right. Now they are in the government, so we are left as anti-racists in the streets. The only social and political force to try to change things. So maybe from the political point of view, things are even worse, because there is no opposition in the country except from No Borders or anti-racist movement. No big party is taking our part.
Okay,
and in the pandemic, they try to justify the stopping of boats in the high sea, preventing people to disembark, and they also imaged sanatoria, how do you say, an amnesty for irregular migrants. And the first argument was because of a health problem. So we want everyone to have a permit to stay in order to be controlled and be safe. Then they passed a law, very selective, and only people who will work in the agricultural field will receive a permit to stay. So it's very utilitaristic. Only people who are useful will come from the irregular status to a regular one.
Okay, thanks, Federico. Maybe if Janna and Victoria just very, very briefly just respond, and then I can turn to the questions.
For me, when this Black Lives Matter came in, it was an eye opener, because I'd never seen the asylum system as racist, like racism, because I've grown up in it and I didn't recognize it, that it was a racist system. And I'm not just talking about here in the UK, I'm talking about in Zimbabwe, I'm talking about where I was born in Malawi. The system, the colonial system that was established back then, is still prevalent now. It's still working now, and it's what's causing all of this instability all the time. So it's like all rigged. We have no power. It's all rigged, and we are constantly running back and like what did I say yesterday? Hamster wheel. Very tiring system, but I don't know.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. So maybe Janna, if you can say a few words, just briefly.
I mean, I would just say, on the one hand, there's lots of overlaps, and I think it's sort of given our project more of a mandate. One of the big calls that has happened through Black Lives Matter is for more history of colonialism in the curriculum in secondary schools and primary schools, and also more history around people's experiences, people of color's experiences. So, and more sort of inclusion of that in curriculum. So I think, in terms of the next steps of our project, that seems like a really important sort of space in schools. It's definitely an area that we talked about expanding the project into. The other side that we didn't get to talk about so much is that neither in the theater nor in the newspaper were we ever able to explore what Victoria was talking about, which is communities of support and how they're articulating themselves amongst refugee groups, and also like how sophisticated those technologies of care and support are, and how much the cultures that claim to be the host or home cultures actually have to learn from those experiences. That people are bringing a lot of technologies, a lot of intelligences around care and collectivity that we need to understand and learn from, be quiet, sort of learn from. So I think there's a lot of just sort of changing the dynamic around education, around who's speaking, you know, and who's listening, because this was one of the things that the project tried to do in its very tiny, modest way, but, you know, that we need to do on a much broader scale. So, you know, I mean, I think as we think about next steps, that's something we're thinking about. The newspaper form doesn't actually allow us to talk about that. So maybe that's not the form we're going to use. It's going to be some other kind of form, theater or other ways of talking to people in their lives that sort of share with them these kinds of practices that are just completely alienate, you know, the lack of these communal practices and support practices in white culture are completely fueling the racism and the xenophobia that is ignited by the media. So anyway.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Janna. Okay, so we've got a few questions. And I think, yeah, so we've actually got, so what we're going to do is we're going to answer the first few questions. And then what we'll do is we're going to email the response, we're going to basically email answers to the other questions. The first question is about a reference for the memory construction method. That will be emailed because that'll just be easier to do. So yeah, so there's a question from Paul Long, and he says that the double standard newspaper looks fascinating. I'd like to hear about theatrical work. Has it been possible or desirable to create space for migrants to talk about more than the experience of being migrants? After all, one of the limitations of the label and circumstance is the reduction of various identities people bring with them. I asked, while recognizing the current outline and importance of amplifying the experience of migrants as migrants. So I mean, I think just to, I mean, I'll still briefly respond. Maybe I'm not sure if the others could say a little bit more about the double. Maybe Janna and Victoria could say more about double standard and the theater. But I'd say that on one hand, I'd say one of the things that we were doing in our book when we talked about people being constructed as migrants, and so we were trying to draw that out. But that's different. That's different from asking people to talk about their migration journey, because as I said, that's kind of what's conventionally asked. But what we were trying to find out is how have people been put in that category. But I think also what we were asking, which was different, which was more than asking about people, how people have been constructed as migrants, was about we were trying to ask for their views about the countries they've left. We were trying to ask for their views about global inequalities, and these are the sorts of issues that people don't often get asked for their opinion on. So I think we were trying to do that as well. And I think with the I think that the first page of the double standard was about looking at the kind of hypocrisy of a system where you know, you have sort of oligarchs and holders of golden visas who can travel around very easily, you know, despite the kind of dodgy you know, places some of them may have got their money from, while making it very hard. I think Victoria, like the way you put it, is like someone who's you know, someone who's fleeing won't have the same ability as someone who's got those kinds of resources. But that's not so much about people's personal experience of being migrants as making a kind of, you know, an overall comment on the migration system. I'm not sure if Janna and Victoria has anything you wanted to add there.
Yeah, so for me, I think the double standard was to just highlight the hypocrisy of, you know, the government here. They say we don't want migrants, and then you look at the governments back home, the major companies that are reaping resources from our countries are foreigners. And then we look at, you know, we're letting you in our country, and you're taking away our resources. And then when we come here and we tell you we don't have, we're poor, we're suffering, we need, you know, we need to rebuild our lives. And that's the same way. We're not bringing in the money, but we're bringing in our skills to get some resources back to our country. So you will hear a lot of people that come here as well and say, I don't want to live in the UK for the rest of my life. I want to go back home. But there's nothing to go back home to, because all the resources are being raped away from our children, from us. So there's nothing for me and my children there. So I'd rather come here and build a life here for my children and educate them. Hopefully, I'll retire back home. That's it.
Okay, thanks.
The other point, I guess, to make is that in some ways that we ended on that question, which was, you know, like what I was talking about before, that actually we started to talk a lot more about care, practices of care, and how to translate those to wider communities, which didn't have to do necessarily with being a migrant, but being someone who's in the world and practicing feminist collectivity, as far as I would be able to read it, you know, that there was a lot of learning that as we started to talk about how you survive the system, there's a lot of learning about, you know, all of the different sophisticated ways that people have found to form very strong collectives like Global Sistaz United. So I think we felt that that would be the next phase of the project, would actually be to go far more into that. And Victoria, you have also an amazing writing practice, and so do other members of the group, in terms of sort of relaying everyday life, you know, sort of semi-fictional accounts everyday life that are really thick and rich descriptions that are, you know, somehow have something to do with being a migrant or being constructed as one, but are very much about so many other things. So I think it's an important point. It's sort of just different phases we've gone through in the project, and this would be the next one, would be to kind of break out of the construction of migrant or migrantification into something else.
Yeah, okay, thanks. And there's a very similar question from Cleodana Cunningham. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. So it's in terms of the research design, especially interviews, how do you approach asking migrants and refugees about their experiences without simultaneously reifying those same categories? Yeah, I think it's a little bit similar to the previous question. And so I'd say that I think maybe, again, I think the key difference is that, I mean, the conventional approach is to ask people about their migration journeys. You know, how did you get to the UK? How did you get to Italy? And usually, and I think as Federico said, there's this kind of narrative about being grateful that usually comes along with it. And so, I mean, we were, as I said, we were trying to ask people about their experiences of the immigration system, and why, and I mean, unfortunately, that does reify the category of the migrant. But I mean, this is how people were being treated. And so we were trying to foreground that in certain ways, because we're looking at the concept of being made a migrant. However, in other aspects of the interviews, we also asked them about many different things. Like, for example, one of the interludes within the chapters is we asked people what people did for fun. And that was a very awkward question, because people were kind of used to being, you know, no one was being used to asking that kind of question. And because people are living such difficult lives, it was a very awkward question to ask. But that turned up some very surprising, you know, interesting responses. About people talked about things like, you know, people talked about stand-up comedy, people talked about Bollywood, but also what's interesting is that people would be developing a kind of political critique through watching news comedy, and again, this gets more into the territory of like people providing an analysis about global inequality, and about the sorts of you know, the kinds of issues that Victoria's just pointed out around how some people have mobility and others don't, and around the exploitation of resources. So I think that's where we were. That was where we're kind of moving away from that. But I think I think, you know, as Janna was saying, I think it is important. I think in future work to break out of that. I think maybe we could just ask. We're going to go through a couple more questions before we wrap this up. So there's a question about translation. No, sorry. There's a wait a minute. There's there's a question about anti-refugee groups. I think maybe Federico and I can answer that one. So I think the project included some researching anti-refugee online groups. What was it like doing this? What did you find? Do you think that it is possible to get through to these sorry, I just lost the thing. Do you think it's possible to get through these people somehow? So in the UK, that we looked at a group called Refugees, a Facebook group called Refugees Not Welcome. And I think Federico looked at a group that was called Stop Invasion. And what we I think where these are very different from the kind of solidarity groups is that instead of the solidarity groups are very practical, and they're all about things like organizing donations, and because they're so practical, they didn't really ask a lot of larger questions about, I mean, what's the purpose of our group? But with the anti-refugee groups, it was mostly conspiracy theories. And most of these were around the kind of great replacement theory, this idea that that there's a kind of you know, somehow socially engineered attempt to replace white populations with brown ones, and you know, all kinds of conspiracy theories around Islam, and particularly around Islam and women, and there are all kinds of sort of paranoid fantasies about sort of Muslim men as sexual predators and white women as kind of either willing or unwilling victims. So there was a lot of that sort of stuff. A lot of this, some of this came from, either sources like that we might expect, like Breitbart and so on, or conspiracy blogs that looked very kind of respectable in their kind of graphic design, but had some pretty bad kind of content. But also the other thing we noticed is that, a lot of the groups that we looked at were mostly sharing news articles, and they would, and even if the articles themselves weren't xenophobic, but what they would do is they would frame them, or in some case translate them if they're in other languages, in a way that highlighted the xenophobic content. And a lot of it seemed to, through insinuation. Yeah, in terms of how to get through to these people, I don't think I don't think that it'll be possible to stage a kind of intervention in these kinds of online forums. They're not the place to do it, but if people do have xenophobic views, then it is important to challenge them, and to also debunk, I think, where some of these conspiracy theories come from. But I'm not sure whether those online forums is a place to do it. I'm not sure if Federico has anything you wanted to say about the group that you looked at.
The group I started on Facebook, called Against the Invasion, had two main frames for the news, let's say, or posts. One was against any action of solidarity, because being solidar with refugees was a crime per se. You don't have the right to be solidar with others. So against NGOs. So this conspiracy that you mentioned before was on the fact that there were connections between NGOs and traffickers, and that there is a big business going around on NGOs, and this is why they are coming all to Italy, etc., etc. The other frame was against lacking resources. So they built constantly a conflict between, let's say, underclass, local underclass, and migrants. So you see government cut resources for healthcare, for services in poor neighborhood, Italian of course, and made this and this for migrants. So this constantly making competition on resources. This was the main thing. Yeah, that's all.
Federico. So I think we'll just go through one last question. So, and this is our last question. So there's a question about translation. Yeah. So let's see. So I'm just going to see if I can. Sorry, I can find. Yeah, and I think there's something about. Yeah, there's great diversity amongst refugees from East Africa, West Africa, the Middle East, etc., including language barriers. How did you work to overcome those barriers, and how do you see the role of translation? Yeah, and I would say that was the case with the groups that we've studied. The people did come from a lot of different backgrounds, and I mean, on a practical level, what we did is that often people would translate for each other, and so when we did interviews, they would bring along fellow member of the group or a mate, and they would help them translate. Is how they would do it. And was that the case? So on your side in Italy, was that also the case?
Yeah, most of the people in reality speak already enough Italian to speak just Italian with each other. The one who just arrived, let's say, were mostly from Francophonia, so they speak French. So we didn't have particular problem with translations.
Yeah, Janna.
I would say one of the things that we sort of did when we were working with Implicated was we concentrated on these kind of scenarios which didn't require a huge amount of language use. So like the circle and trying to get through. And one of the things that really came out when we played that out with people who were not from migrant backgrounds is they would walk in and they would just say to the shop owner, or they'd say to the NHS worker, well, can you give me this, 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 and this? And of course we would all say, well, stop, you speak perfect English, like this isn't the scenario that you would have. And so one of the situations that, or one of the, I guess, strategies for us was to create these images that didn't require a huge amount of language. So it's kind of one of the reasons we maybe didn't use scripts. and did use these kind of more image scenarios that people could perform with their bodies, also to talk about the way that the body functions in these. And that was something we didn't talk about, but there's the translation of language, but there's also the ways in which sort of bodies organize themselves. And there was a lot of discussion about body language, about the person who, was nice to you until you said you were a refugee and they then started to frown, or they turned their back on you, or a lot of the things that people were describing were really gestural kinds of experiences in everyday life. So I think there was also that kind of thinking that we could use the way in which bodies communicate as part of the analysis, and not just the kind of verbal language.
Okay, all right, thanks, Janna. So I think that, there's some other questions, but I think given that, we've already run over about 20 minutes, I think what we'll do is we'll answer those questions over email, if that's okay. So maybe, I think the organizers will send us a list of questions, and we can email them out, and we can possibly post them as a blog post. So I just wanted to say, just wanted to finish by saying thanks to everyone for coming. And thanks everyone for participating in this, and thanks for your questions, as I will answer them. And again, thanks to to Victoria, to Federico, to Janna, to MUP for organizing this, for everyone for coming, and thanks for your time, and
read our book.
Let's see the book.
This was such an interesting
event.
Thanks everyone, this was such an interesting event, and I think this is a good moment to wrap up and thank everyone for attending, but also to thank you, Kirsten, Janna, Victoria and Federico for giving up your time to participate.